Right. Okay.
Good news. Good news. Good news.
World War I claimed an estimated 15 million lives, including 60,000 Australians, according to the War Memorial in Canberra. But our next guest says it wasn't just human life that perished in the so-called Great War. It was religious faith itself. Peter Hitchens has written widely about the effect of the war on Christianity in Europe, most notably in his best-selling book, The Rage Against God. Peter's a columnist with the Mail on Sunday and a frequent guest on this program. When Peter Hitchens was in Australia, he joined me on a stroll through Hyde Park, and he pointed out to me, a native Sydney-sider, something I'd never noticed about the War Memorial.
The thing which is very striking about it is the way in which it displays the body of a dead soldier in an almost Christ-like position. This is very striking to me because in writing The Rage Against God, one of the things that I stressed was that in Britain, particularly since 1918, religion has become very much mixed up with the commemoration of war and with patriotism in a way which I find slightly disturbing and worrying because I don't think the two really mix. And for instance, there's a famous hymn in the Church of England, not much sung anymore, called O Valiant Hearts, which pretty much suggests that the soldiers who died in the First World War were making a sacrifice similar to that of Christ. And then there's that very well-known poem turned into a hymn, I Vow to Thee, My Country, which also seems to me to mix up patriotism and religion in a way which is quite disturbing if you think that war is something which Christianity is really fundamentally against and can only countenance under very, very strict conditions. I have to say, I must add, it's a very fine memorial and one which I find profoundly moving, as I do with all war memorials. I've made a point to stop at all war memorials and examine them. I think everybody should do that because at the very least you should read some of the names there to make sure that they are indeed not forgotten.
Well, I thank you for pointing out to me something that was before my very eyes, but in a way I was blind to. Peter, you write in The Rage Against God that the Gospels could not really be made to endorse or excuse the gross mass murder, the rapid loss of all delicacy of language and feeling, everything which had been considered good and fair before. I mean, is that what you think World War I did to Christianity?
It's one of the things that it did. Because the war had been elevated into a sort of new crusade, the Great War for Civilization, because the enemy had been defined as a barbarian threat to Christian civilization. And this happened on both sides, I might say. The whole truth about what was going on in the trenches, particularly, which contradicted this so much, was largely unknown at the time, but has since become known. And I think as people have come to know what actually happened, the contradiction has become stronger.
Well, you actually said in a previous discussion that World War I was largely responsible, in your view, for the beginning of the end of Christianity, if not in Europe, then certainly in Britain.
I think it can be said to be the end of Christendom in Europe, really. The whole idea of Europe as a Christian continent has not survived it. It's interesting that Christianity still survives much more strongly in North America, which simply didn't undergo the same experience. But the shock of it, the complete destruction of so much of the self-restraint and of the gentleness which I believe existed in Europe before 1914, and the fact that the churches so enthusiastically, in some cases rather crudely, endorsed it at its beginnings, seems to me to be one of the most important facts about that war, which has been rightly described as the most important event since the fall of the Roman Empire in terms of human civilization, in terms of the damage that it did, I think.
Well, about 4 years ago, in a celebrated public discussion that you had with your late brother Christopher, I think you both agreed, Peter, that World War I signalled the end of Christendom.
Well, I think before 1914, the European continent, and this would have included Russia, was a Christian continent. Whatever actual part of the Christian church people belonged to, whether it was the Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, or the Protestant, it was a continent in which it was agreed by most people that the Christian religion was true, and the Christian religion was the principle by which lives should be lived, laws should be made, civilization sustained. After the war was over, in terms of public thought, in terms of artistic expression, in terms of language, in terms of morals, that was no longer the case. Now, it took a while, as it always does, for this change to become evident. And it's my view that it didn't really become wholly evident until after the Second World War that it had suffered such damage. In the simple measure of the willingness of people to go to church and to worship God and to pray and to read the Bible and to steep themselves in Christian thought, and the readiness of society to expect that of them, this has now collapsed almost completely in Britain. And there's a wonderful book written actually by a non-Christian, by Stefan Zweig, the great Austrian novelist and writer, called The World of Yesterday, which describes pre-1914 Vienna. And one of the things about it is that people are so much more restrained, so much more gentle, so much less accustomed to wild outbursts of temper and bad language than they are now. This transformation is incredibly profound.
Well, let's turn to your country of Britain. How much damage did the war do, particularly to the Church of England? Because you've made the point that the Church of England, being the national church, being in some way associated with the state, it wore a lot of collateral damage for the actions of the British state in going into World War I.
Oh yes, and initially, in the first months of the war, the church was extremely, almost shockingly enthusiastic about the war, and urged people to sign up and referred to it as a war for civilization. And then there was these strange events like the alleged appearance of angels at Mons when the British army was being forced back by the Germans. And it associated in people's minds the church hierarchy with the political hierarchy, with all the other frock-coated, white-haired old geezers who were saying this war is one in which we must all, or rather in their cases, you must all go off and risk your lives because the cause is great. And one of the causes that was supposedly so great, apart from it being a great war for civilization, and those words were actually inscribed on the medals issued to those who served in the war at the end, apart from it being a great war for civilization, was that it was a war to end war. Now that sustained it until 1939, when it became quite clear that it hadn't ended war at all, and that completely discredited it. And I think the outbreak of war in 1939 was the final blow to anybody who'd believed in 1914 that this had been a war for civilization, let alone a war to end war. It was the end of it. It just, from then on, the reputation of that war has sunk and sunk and sunk, and nobody can really find a seriously good word to say for it. A similar process is going to overtake the Second World War, which is still believed by many to be a good war, but it hasn't happened yet.
Did World War I, in a very practical sense, denude Britain of a lot of practising Christian men?
Well, it certainly did. In Britain, this was a specific problem, and one which I don't think is examined enough. For the first 2 years of the war, the British Army was composed entirely of volunteers. Conscription did not come in until 1916. And at a time when a war is being promoted as an ethical, as a moral duty, as a Christian duty, and something which all persons of spirit, feeling, and goodness should take part in, those who go off and volunteer for the colours will be the best you have, and also the youngest. And I think huge numbers of young men from all classes, and this was very much not a class-divided recruitment. Young men from all classes left homes and families, in many cases before they'd had time to beget children, and certainly before they had time to be influential fathers in their children's lives, and went off and were killed. And as a result, they did not leave behind them progeny who would follow their example. And the other thing was that their own talents and their own moral strength and all the good things that they had in them were thrown away in the mud. and irrecoverably. Who knows how many Nobel Prize winners, how many great poets, how many tremendous scientists, engineers, possible leaders of the country were just tossed away in wave after wave as they walk towards machine gun fire in mad offensives. It's revolting to consider. Something similar did happen in the other countries, but it was the fact that the first wave were volunteers that I think made it so devastating.
To what extent were the bishops cheerleaders for the war? You've mentioned there was an enthusiastic talk of duty, but I'm wondering whether they gave it some sort of theological justification as well, rather than simply patriotism, rather than simply being a good Englishman, whether there was almost a meta-narrative going on there.
Well, there was a suggestion constantly made that the enemy was a barbaric foe of civilization. The idea that this was once again the barbarians sweeping across Europe and threatening to extinguish Christian civilization. Of course, something similar was being said in Germany, where the churches also endorsed it. And it's quite disturbing for an English person to go to Germany and see First World War memorials there, which are very often full of Christian imagery and suggesting that the German soldiers were also dying for the Christian cause of civilization, and indeed as is famously said so many times, on the belt buckles of the German soldiers are the words "Gott mit uns," God with us, God on our side. So they believed it too. And I think the real moment when people began to suspect that something was up was when the Christmas truce broke out in 1914. And it broke out with the common singing of Christmas carols by men who turned out to have a good deal more in common with each other than they had with their generals or governments.
Well, yes, Robert Mackenzie, a historian at Wheaton College in the United States, he was writing, I think, recently in Christianity Today, and he said that World War I was in fact a civil war within Christianity. It wasn't really, as some presented it, a war against the heathen.
Well, it certainly wasn't that. It started as an old-fashioned land grab by Germany. I think there's much doubt about that now since the discoveries of the great German historian Fritz Fischer. It was a German-contrived aggression in the hope of seizing large amounts of Russian territory and stopping the growth of Russia as a rival. And they started it, and there's not much doubt about that. But that's just a typical war. The other powers in the war tended to grab territory outside Europe rather than within it, for which it's hard to make a moral case either. But it wasn't a war between, as one can, to some extent, portray the Second World War, though it becomes difficult when you think about it. It wasn't a war between good and bad. It was a war between an aggressor and countries which were defending themselves, but the aggressor was a reasonably civilized, reasonably free, reasonably law-governed country, and it wasn't in the hands of racialist megalomaniacs, for instance. So you simply can't make out that Kaiser's Germany was the contemporary equivalent of Hitler's Germany, because it wasn't. And nobody really emerges, once the war is examined, nobody really emerges with a huge amount of moral credit. The behavior of both sides towards captured prisoners of war was completely atrocious, and Robert Graves, in Goodbye to All That, openly described in a book published a few years after the war the regular killing of surrendered prisoners of war by British troops. These dreadful things were done, and one might add a greatly forgotten episode is the British naval blockade of Germany, which inevitably fell most heavily upon civilians and indeed upon children who effectively were starving to death as a result of it. Terrible things were done in this war. No one can claim that it was a war conducted by either side with particular amounts of chivalry.
What do you make then, Peter, of the argument by another US historian, Philip Jenkins of Baylor University? In his recent book, The Great and Holy War, he argues that it did become a religious crusade.
Well, I think he's broadly right that this is the way in which it was taken on. One must remember that it was perhaps the first democratic war. On the side of the Allies, rather than the Central Powers, the countries involved were, for the most part, you just have to leave out Russia in this calculation, but certainly in the case of France and Britain and later the United States, and of course the ANZAC contribution as well, these were democracies. And as Winston Churchill said prophetically in 1901, the wars of democracies will be much more savage than the wars of kings, because he understood that to arouse a democracy against an enemy, you're going to have to tell the people that this is a crusade, that this is a sacred war. And having done that, of course, you can't then compromise. you have to fight to the end, because you've declared your enemy to be so evil that a compromise would itself be evil. And this is this is one of the characteristics of it. The Churchill, oddly enough, was one of the very few to foresee, but it undoubtedly was the reason why many attempts to reach a negotiated peace failed, because the democratic leaders of the Allied countries simply couldn't find any way of selling such a peace to the populations whom they told were engaging in a crusade. Similar problems were, oddly enough, encountered in Germany. And the war had also become a national effort. The moment when the Social Democrats voted for the war credits, the Kaiser said, "I see no parties here in the Reichstag anymore, only Germans." And there was this tremendous view of unity. And of course the French had the so-called Union Sacrée, the sacred union of all the parties. And one of the road to Verdun became known as the Voie Sacrée, the holy consecrated road, which led to a battlefield. This belief that it was a holy war was very, very widespread and very powerful in changing its course.
And I think you captured it in just one sentence that you wrote, where you said, "The conscription of faith into unjust wars does grave harm to faith."
Well, undoubtedly it does, because one of the things which has to be at the very heart of the Christian religion is that if violence is to be done at all, then it has to be done for justice. And if you pretend that something is just which is not, and portray something as just which isn't, and you do that in the name of faith, then it has to rebound onto the faith that's been used to do so, hasn't it? People have been asked to do something in the name of the central goodness with which they've been brought up, the thing which they've been brought up to believe is at the heart of all goodness, and they find that in fact it's been urging them to do something which simply isn't justified.
Peter Hitchens, as always, it's been a great pleasure to have you on the Religion and Ethics Report. Peter is a columnist with the Mail on Sunday. He's the author of many books. We've been speaking principally today about his book, The Rage Against God. Peter, thank you for joining us to discuss the effect of World War I on religion.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
And there'll be a slightly longer version of that interview with Peter on the Religion and Ethics Report homepage at the RN website, and that's where you can download all of today's stories and leave a comment. By the way, a spokesman for the ANZAC Memorial insists that that sculpture, titled "The Sacrifice," is secular, despite its evocative nature, and it's based on the story of the Spartan warrior. And the music you were hearing is from Graham Cohn's score to the ballet production 1914, based on David Malouf's novel Fly Away, Peter. A big thanks to our great production team, producer Scott Spark and technical producer Lila Shunner. Breakfast is next.